Interactive Science, Ecology, and the Environment. In this book, we are going to be looking at types of living things and how they live and interact with each other in communities and in the world. We are also going to be talking about resources and living things like land, air, water, and energy. Chapter 1, Populations and Communities. Before we begin, take time to pause this video and come up with a list of observations you have for this picture. Some things I observe are the fish. The fish are orange and white. It looks like they're swimming nearby or kind of just chilling in this little plant looking thing. The plant is kind of green. It looks like it's dark in the background, so maybe they're deeper down into the water. Why do clownfish play with poison? The big question is, how do living things affect one another? It says clownfish live among the poisonous and stinging tentacles of sea anemones to avoid being eaten by larger fish. Amazingly, the clownfish do not get stung. This is because a fluid called mucus protects the skin of the fish. Developing a hypothesis. How might a sea anemone benefit from having clownfish around? Take time to write this on your worksheet. These are the words that we're going to be discussing throughout Chapter 1. Take time as I read these words and jot down the ones that you do not know 100% on a notebook or a piece of paper. Organism, habitat, biotic factor, abiotic factor, species, population, community, ecosystem, ecology, birth rate, death rate, immigration, emigration, population density, limiting, factor, carrying capacity, natural selection, adaptation, niche, competition, predation, predator, prey, symbiosis, mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, parasite, host, succession, primary succession, pioneer species, and secondary succession. Make sure you have any of those words you do not know jotted down. Lesson 1. Living things and the environment. Unlocking the big question. Remember, our big question is, how do living things affect one another? Ways to unlock that. We are going to learn about what does an organism get from its environment? What are the two parts of an organism's habitat? And how is an ecosystem organized? My Planet Diary. Love song. The gray, brown, and Goodman's mouse lemurs are some of the world's smallest primates. These three lemurs look similar. Looking so similar makes it difficult for the lemurs to find members of their own kind or species during mating season. However, it seems that the lemurs can identify their own species by song. Scientists recorded the mating calls of the three species of lemurs. They discovered that the lemurs reacted more to the calls from their own species. This allows the lemurs to pick the right mate even at night. So we have the pictures here of the gray mouse lemur, the brown mouse lemur, and the Goodman's mouse lemur. They look relatively small. It says, answer these questions. Number 1. If you were looking for your sneakers among several pairs that looked just like yours, what characteristics would make it easier for you to find them? And number 2, what do you think would happen if a lemur mated with a different kind of lemur? Answer your questions on the worksheet provided. What does an organism get from its environment? If you were to visit Alaska, you might see a bald eagle fly by. A bald eagle is one type of organism, or living thing. Different types of organisms live in different types of surroundings, or environments. An organism gets food, water, shelter, and other things it needs to live, grow, and reproduce from its environment. An environment that provides the things a specific organism needs to live, grow, and reproduce is called its habitat. In a forest habitat, mushrooms grow in the damp soil and woodpeckers build nests in tree trunks. Organisms live in different habitats because they have different requirements for survival and reproduction. Some organisms live on a prairie with its flat terrain, tall grasses, and low rainfall amounts. A prairie dog, like the one shown in Figure 1, obtains the food and shelter it needs from a prairie habitat. It could not survive on this rocky ocean shore. Likewise, the prairie would not meet the needs of a sea star. Figure 1. What's wrong with this picture? Most people would never expect to see a prairie dog at the beach. Give 3 reasons why this prairie dog would not survive in this habitat. Answer the question on the worksheet provided. What are the 2 parts of an organism's habitat? To meet its needs, a prairie dog must interact with more than just the other prairie dogs around it. An organism interacts with both the living and non-living parts of its habitat. Biotic factors. What living things can you see in the prairie dog's habitat shown in Figure 2? The parts of a habitat that are living, or once living, and interact with an organism are called biotic factors. The plants that provide seeds and berries are biotic factors. The ferrets and eagles that hunt the prairie dog are also biotic factors. Worms and bacteria are biotic factors that live in the soil underneath the prairie grass. Prairie dog scat, owl pellets, and decomposing plant matter are also biotic factors. Abiotic factors. Not all of the factors that organisms interact with are living. Abiotic factors are the non-living parts of an organism's habitat. These factors, as shown in Figure 2, include sunlight, soil, temperature, oxygen, and water. So we know biotic factors means that something is or was once living. Abiotic factors means that they are not living or never have been living. In this case, the prefix a for abiotic means not. So it is not biotic, it is not living. Let's take a closer peek at Figure 2. Factors in a prairie habitat. A prairie dog interacts with many biotic and abiotic factors in the prairie habitat. Sunlight. Because sunlight is needed for plants to make their own food, it is an important abiotic factor for most living things. Soil. Soil consists of varying amounts of rock fragments, nutrients, air, water, and the decaying remains of living things. The soil in an area influences the kinds of plants and animals that can live and grow there. Temperature. The temperatures that are typical in an area determine the types of organisms that can live there. Oxygen. Most living things require oxygen to carry out their life processes. Organisms on land obtain oxygen from air. Aquatic organisms obtain oxygen that is dissolved in the water around them. Water. All living things require water to carry out their life processes. Plants and algae need water along with sunlight and carbon dioxide to make their own food. Other living things depend on plants and algae for food. The question asks to add another biotic factor to the picture, and then draw a line from each abiotic factor in the text box to an example in the picture. There is a worksheet question going alongside with this. Apply it! Salt is an abiotic factor found in some environments. To see how the amount of salt affects the hatching of brine shrimp eggs, varying amounts of salt were added to 4 different 500 milliliter beakers. On our side, we have our first beaker, beaker A, that has just 500 milliliters of spring water. Beaker B has 500 milliliters of spring water plus 2.5 grams of salt. Beaker C has 500 milliliters of spring water plus 7.5 grams of salt. And beaker D has 500 milliliters of spring water plus 15 grams of salt. Number 1 says, observe, in which beaker or beakers did the eggs shown as purple hatch? Well, if we take a peek, we see that there is only purple circles, so the eggs in beaker A. Beaker B, C, and D, however, look like they have some kind of animal also inside. So we can say B, C, and D had some eggs that hatched. Number 2 says infer. The manipulated variable was So, what was being changed? What was being changed in each variable in each beaker was the amount of salt. So beaker A had no salt, beaker B had 2.5 salt, and then grams of salt. And then they kept adding more grams of salt for the other beakers. So what was being changed? What was the manipulated variable? The amount of salt. Number 3 says infer. The responding variable was well, we kept changing the amount of salt in each beaker, and because different amounts of salt were added, different number of shrimp hatched. So the responding variable was the number of hatching shrimp. Number 4 is a challenge question. Which beaker was the control? If you said beaker A, you would be correct. Beaker A had nothing else added to it besides just the eggs and 500 milliliters of spring water. The other beakers had salt that was also added to the 500 milliliters of spring water. So beaker A was the control. And number 5 says, draw conclusions. What can you conclude about the amount of salt in the shrimp's natural habitat? So if the shrimp weren't just in beakers and they were out in the real world, doing taxes probably, what can you conclude about the amount of salt in their habitat? I would say that probably their natural habitat has a similar amount of salt to beaker B, because that is where the most eggs hatched. I know that beaker A, none of the eggs hatched, so there has to be salt water in the shrimp's natural habitat. It looks like beaker D, only 2 hatched, beaker C, 6 hatched, and beaker B, more than 6 hatched that I can count just by looking at the picture. So probably beaker B is the closest to what their natural habitat is. Assess your understanding. Number 1, list 2 biotic and 2 abiotic factors, just in general. 2 biotic and 2 abiotic factors. Well, we know biotic means living, so 2 biotic factors could be grass and eagles. And we know abiotic means not living, so it could be sunlight or the rocky part of soil. Letter B says, name 2 abiotic factors in your habitat and explain how your life would be different without them. While 2 abiotic factors in my habitat are sunlight and oxygen. If there was no sunlight, I would not have enough food to eat, or even be able to see outside what food is where. And if there were no oxygen, well, I wouldn't be able to breathe, because I, a human, need oxygen to survive. I get it! Now I know that the 2 parts of an organism's habitat are Did you say living or biotic factors and non-living or abiotic factors? Because if that's so, you'd be correct. Miss Reams, I don't get it, and I need extra help with... I don't know. That's up to you. Mine just says TE note. So, let me know what you still need help with. And I will talk to you tomorrow. Just kidding. Oh, it continues. Oh! You and I both thought we were done, but we're not. Now we gotta learn about how an ecosystem is organized. Most organisms do not live all alone in their habitat. Instead, organisms live together in populations and communities that interact with abiotic factors in their ecosystems. Organisms. Black-tailed prairie dogs that live in prairie dog towns on the Nebraska plains are all members of one species. A species is a group of organisms that can mate with each other and produce offspring that can also mate and reproduce. Population. All the members of one species living in a particular area are referred to as a population. The prairie dogs in the Nebraska town are one example of a population. Communities. A particular area contains more than one species of organism. The prairie, for instance, includes prairie dogs, hawks, snakes, and grasses. All the different populations that live together in an area make up a community. Ecosystems. The community of organisms that live in a particular area, along with their non-living environment, make up an ecosystem. A prairie is just one of the many different ecosystems found on Earth. Other ecosystems are deserts, oceans, ponds, or forests. Figure 3 shows the level of organization in a prairie ecosystem. The smallest level of organization is a single organism, which belongs to a population that includes other members of its species. The population belongs to a community of different species. The community and abiotic factors together form an ecosystem. Because the populations in an ecosystem interact with one another, any change affects all the different populations that live there. The study of how organisms interact with each other and with their environment is called ecology. Here we have figure 3. In this figure, the smallest level of organization is the organism. The largest is the entire ecosystem. So we start small with one organism. In this example, we have the black-tailed prairie dog, but only one black-tailed prairie dog. Now let's say the black-tailed prairie dog is going home after a long day of work to his family. Well, that's the population. The organism is in the population, so all the prairie dogs in that area. Then, that population, all those prairie dogs, get thrown into a bigger pool called community. That's all the living things that interact in that area, in this case, the prairie. So we have not just prairie dogs, but we also have hawks. It looks like a badger. We have grass. All those are living and they interact with each other. And then we have the ecosystem. That's all living and non-living things that interact in the area, in this case again, the prairie. So that is the prairie dogs, that's the snakes, that's the badger, that's the grass, that's the sun, that's the temperature, that's the rocks, water, the bison in the background. They all go and live together. So you start small and you expand until you have everything in one giant gulp. So our applied concept says, draw or write how an ecosystem of your choice is organized. Identify each level, so organism, population, community, and ecosystem. And then include biotic and abiotic examples. One example could be, which you cannot use because I am using it. On the beach is a crab. A crab is an organism. More crabs are found near the water. All of the same kind of crab make up a population. Clams, seaweed, and gulls are also on the beach. The crabs, clams, seaweed, and gulls make a community. In addition to the living things, the sand, ocean water, and sunlight make up the ecosystem. So on your worksheet, create your own, or talk to me, not create your own, but talk to me about how your choice of ecosystem is organized. Assess your understanding. 2A. Classify. All of the different kinds of organisms in a forest are a community or a population. Well, we know that a population are all the members of one species that live in an area, but they want all different kinds of organisms in the forest. So that would be a community. So it's all the different types of populations living together, sometimes in harmony, sometimes not. That is a community. Letter B says, how do living things affect one another? Well, we know living things live together, and so they interact with one another. Sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, sometimes for food, and who knows if that's good or bad. Oh, I get it! Now I know that ecosystems are organized into... If you said organisms, populations, and communities, you'd be correct. Ms. Reams, I don't get it. And I need extra help with what? Make sure you have all the questions answered on your worksheet. And I will see you tomorrow, for realsies this time, to talk about populations. Goodbye.